The year is 1066. England has been ruled by Edward the Confessor for the past 23 years. However, the king has no legitimate heirs. There are three people who believe that they should take the throne, namely William, Duke of Normandy, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and Canute, King of Norway. In October of 1066, the Norwegians invaded northern England, but were defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. 2 weeks later, the Normans landed in southern England. This was the beginning of the end for Saxon England. On October, the English army led by Harold met the Normans at the Battle of Hastings, where the fate of England would be decided. Now, if you're a history buff, then you probably know how this one ends. But I didn't know anything about it before writing this script. So let me ask you a few questions to get you thinking like I was at the time. How did William become the heir to the English throne? Why did Harold fight back against him? And what would happen as a result of the battle? Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe with notifications turned on so that you never miss an epic historical moment. All right, let's do this. A long time before 1066, there was a guy named Rollo who was the leader of some Vikings. Instead of pillaging and plundering around northern France like most of his Viking brethren, he decided to strike a deal with the Frankish king to rule a small slice of northern France. It was called the Duchy of Normandy. As part of the agreement, Rollo converted to Christianity, and his Viking warriors became the personal army of the king. The Dukes of Normandy after Rollo were mostly left alone to do their own thing. They had a degree of autonomy from the kings of France and were able to build up their duchy into a powerful state. By the 11th century, the duchy was incredibly wealthy due to its location along major trade routes and had a well-trained army that was composed of mounted knights. Knights were a new type of warrior that had appeared in Europe during the 10th century. Unlike the heavily armored infantry of the Roman legionaries, these guys were mounted on horseback and used lances and swords to slash and jab at their enemies from close range. They were more maneuverable than the big old foot soldiers, but at the same time, they were still very much frontline fighters. Enter William, the bastard son of Robert the Magnificent, the 7th Duke of Normandy. Don't worry too much about the bastard part just yet. It'll become relevant later. After Robert died in 1035, William became the duke at the age of 7. His mother, Herleva, acted as regent until William came of age. Upon reaching adulthood, William proved himself to be a capable leader and expanded Norman territory into Maine and fought several successful campaigns in France. He was even excommunicated by the Pope for a while because he installed his friend, a guy named Guy, as the bishop of a major city. Apparently, the Pope didn't like that, so he couldn't be a nice guy all the time. Now, in 1064, William set out to conquer the Kingdom of England. Why? Well, a little earlier that year, the childless Edward the Confessor named William as his successor. Now, why would Edward name a French duke over his own subjects? Well, it's partly because Edward was fond of William from when they were both young pages in the court of Aethelstan, but also because William had married Edward's niece. Regardless, the English nobles weren't exactly thrilled about the prospect of foreign rule. Enter Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, who believed that he was the rightful heir to the throne. He actively worked to undermine William's claim and made a secret alliance with the Norwegians under King Canute to invade England together. As soon as Edward died on January 5, 1066, Harold declared himself king. The English nobles accepted him, but the people saw him as a traitor. Anyway, Harold's first order of business was to march north and defeat the Norwegians at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Although technically victorious, Harold lost thousands of troops and had to hurry back south to stop William from taking the throne. In September, William landed his invasion force in southern England with 7,000 troops. He immediately seized the town of Hastings and made camp near the river Ouse. Harold marched south to confront him with about twice as many men. At the same time, word had reached Scotland that England was being invaded, and King Malcolm III raised an army to come to Harold's aid. So now we have two armies, English and Norman, waiting near Hastings to do battle. But who would win? Well, to answer that question, I brought along two experts to do a full breakdown of the battle for us. But before we hear from them, here's a message from our sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is an online learning platform with a mission to help people learn math, science, and computer science in the easiest and most engaging way possible. If you've ever struggled to learn these topics in school, then you'll love Brilliant because they teach everything from fractions to algorithms in a fun, interactive way. You can take lessons wherever you have free time and even learn by doing. That's right, they have thousands of lessons that range in difficulty from beginner to advanced. Plus, you can learn things like AI logic and data science that aren't offered in most schools. All right, back to the battle. Here's what our expert has to say about it. The English army was made up of infantry armed with axes and swords and shields, while the Normans consisted of cavalry armed with lances and swords and knives. There were also some foot soldiers among the Normans. The advantage of the cavalry is that they can move faster and hit harder than the infantry, but they were also vulnerable to arrows. The advantage of the infantry is that there are simply more of them and they have shields to protect themselves. But at the same time, they can only stand and swing their swords. One of the things that tipped the scales in favor of the Normans was the terrain. The battle took place on top of Senlac Hill, which limited the maneuverability of the English infantry. Also, the Normans were able to use their horses to gallop around the hill, which gave them a greater advantage. One of the reasons for the Norman victory was the tactics used by their cavalry. They formed a wedge shape to break through the English lines, and then they flanked them, meaning they attacked them from the sides. This prevented the English from concentrating their forces on one spot and allowed the Normans to slowly but surely push them back. Another factor was the use of archery. Both sides used bows and arrows to harass each other, but the Normans were more effective at it. They had better archers, and they used them in a more strategic way. For example, they used a technique called volley fire, which involved multiple archers releasing their arrows at the same time. This made it harder for the English to defend themselves because they were bombarded with a large number of arrows all at once. Also, the Normans knew how to take advantage of the terrain. They positioned themselves on higher ground, which gave them a better vantage point and allowed them to shoot at the English from above. Now, despite being outnumbered, the English put up a fierce fight, and they were able to hold off the Normans for hours. The battle was brutal and bloody, and it wasn't until late in the day that the Normans finally broke through the English lines. Once the cavalry was able to break through, the outcome of the battle was pretty much decided. The infantry followed behind and secured the victory. The English were completely exhausted, and they couldn't resist much longer. As for why the English lost, I'd say that a combination of factors contributed to their defeat. First, they were outnumbered and outmatched. The Normans had a more disciplined and experienced army. Second, they didn't have a clear advantage in the battle. They tried to make up for their lack of cavalry by forming a strong infantry line, but that didn't really work out. Third, they didn't have a good plan. They just kind of showed up and started fighting. Finally, they were tired. The battle lasted for hours, and by the time the Normans broke through their lines, the English were exhausted and couldn't fight anymore. Thanks so much for helping us out today. So William the Conqueror became the King of England and began the process of subjugating the country. Under his rule, the English language shifted to Norman French, and English customs and culture became more aligned with those of Normandy. William's descendants ruled England for the next 200 years. So if you're watching this video in the UK or the US or Canada or Australia or New Zealand, then there's a good chance you're a descendant of William the Conqueror. And as for Harold, well, legend says that an arrow went through his eye, although there's no evidence to support that claim. Either way, he ended up dead. But what about William? Was he actually the bastard son of Robert the Magnificent? You see, when William was born, his mother, Herleva, wasn't married to the Duke. She was actually a low-ranking member of staff. Because of this, William's claim to the throne was considered illegitimate. However, in 1059, his father officially legitimized him, declaring that he was indeed his son. So technically, William could have been a bastard, but he wasn't a bastard. Got it? Good. If you like this video, check out my follow-up series where I'll be covering how the Normans changed England forever. And thank you to all of our supporters for making these videos possible.